Have you ever faced a situation so impossible that every door seemed locked, every answer disappeared, and even your prayers felt like they were echoing back in silence? Maybe you're living in that moment right now. Maybe you've done everything you know how to do. You've worked harder, you've prayed longer, you've waited patiently, yet the mountain in front of you refuses to move. And somewhere deep inside, a question keeps whispering, God, where are you? What if the greatest miracles don't begin when circumstances change? What if they begin when faith survives without proof? Today, I want to share a story that may change the way you see your struggles forever. Because the God who created the universe has never been limited by what humans call impossible. There was a man named Daniel, not the Daniel everyone admired, not the Daniel who seemed strong on the outside. This Daniel was exhausted. At 38 years old, his life felt like a collection of broken pieces. His business had collapsed, the savings he spent years building had disappeared, the friends who promised to stand by his side slowly vanished when things became difficult. Every morning he woke up carrying the weight of disappointment, and every night he went to sleep wondering how much longer he could keep going. One rainy evening, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. Bills were scattered across the kitchen table. The electricity notice sat in front of him like a countdown clock. His phone remained silent. No opportunities, no solutions, no miracles. Just silence. He lowered his head into his hands and whispered a prayer he had prayed countless times before. God, I don't know what to do anymore. The words weren't polished, they weren't powerful, they were simply honest. For a moment, nothing happened. The room stayed quiet, the rain continued tapping against the window, and Daniel felt exactly the same. That's the part nobody talks about, the painful space between the prayer and the answer, the place where faith is tested, the place where many people give up. Daniel wanted to believe, he really did, but every visible fact seemed to argue against hope. The bank account said impossible. The bills said impossible. His circumstances screamed impossible. Yet deep inside, there was a tiny voice refusing to die. A voice reminding him that God's power had never depended on human circumstances. The next morning, Daniel woke up with no new miracle waiting for him. No unexpected money, no phone call, no dramatic breakthrough. Just another ordinary day. But something was different. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt led to visit a small church on the other side of town. He hadn't been there in years. Part of him almost ignored the feeling. After all, what difference could one church service make? His problems weren't spiritual puzzles, they were real problems, financial problems, life problems, problems that needed actual solutions. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave. So he went. The church wasn't impressive. The building was old, the parking lot was half empty, nothing about it looked extraordinary. But during the service, the pastor shared a simple message. He spoke about moments when God seems silent, moments when heaven feels distant, moments when people assume God has forgotten them. Then he said something Daniel would never forget. Just because God is silent doesn't mean God is absent. The words struck him like lightning. For months, Daniel had interpreted silence as abandonment. He thought no answer meant no action, no breakthrough meant no plan. But what if God was working behind scenes he couldn't see? What if the silence wasn't rejection? What if it was preparation? Driving home, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about those words. For the first time in a long time, he looked at his situation differently. The problems hadn't changed, but his perspective had. And sometimes, that's where transformation begins. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel continued praying, continued believing, continued moving forward one small step at a time. Yet the impossible situation remained, at least on the surface. What Daniel didn't know was that events had already begun unfolding beyond his sight. Conversations were happening, doors were quietly opening, opportunities were forming, pieces were moving into place. The answer wasn't absent, it was approaching. And the moment it arrived would prove something Daniel could never have imagined, because God specializes in situations that human logic has already declared impossible.
But before the breakthrough could appear, before the miracle could reveal itself, Daniel would face one final test of faith, a test that would force him to decide whether he trusted what he saw or the God he couldn't see. And what happened next would change everything.
Daniel stood at the edge of uncertainty, holding on to faith with trembling hands. The pastor's words continued echoing in his mind. Just because God is silent doesn't mean God is absent. He wanted to believe it. He truly did. But believing during a storm is very different from believing after the storm has passed. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge. The landlord called again. The bank sent another warning. Even simple things like buying groceries became a source of stress. Daniel found himself calculating every dollar, wondering how long he could survive before everything completely collapsed. Late one evening, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights outside his window. Thousands of lights stretched across the darkness. Each one represented someone's life, someone's story, someone's struggle. And for the first time, a strange thought entered his mind. What if he wasn't the only person fighting a battle nobody could see? The next morning, Daniel stopped at a small coffee shop before heading home. While waiting in line, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone near the window. The man looked familiar. After a few moments, Daniel realized why. Years ago, before his business failed, he had met this man at a business conference. Back then, the man had been highly successful, respected, influential, someone everyone admired. Yet now he sat quietly, looking older and more tired than Daniel remembered. Their eyes met. The man smiled. Daniel walked over and introduced himself. To his surprise, the man remembered him. They began talking. What started as a brief conversation turned into nearly 2 hours. And during that conversation, Daniel learned something shocking. The successful businessman he once admired had lost almost everything years earlier: his company, his reputation, his financial security. At one point, he had even considered giving up completely. Daniel listened carefully because the man didn't speak like someone reading from a motivational book. He spoke like someone who had survived real pain, real disappointment, real failure. Then the man leaned forward and said something Daniel would never forget. The hardest season of my life became the foundation for the greatest blessings I ever received. Daniel frowned. How? The man smiled. Because everything I trusted had to be removed before I could learn to trust God completely. Those words landed deep. Daniel suddenly realized something uncomfortable. For years, he had trusted his plans more than God's guidance. His confidence came from financial security, business success, predictable outcomes. But when those things disappeared, so did his sense of peace. Maybe the crisis wasn't only revealing what he had lost. Maybe it was revealing what he had been depending on. That night, Daniel knelt beside his bed. But this prayer felt different. For months, he had been asking God to change his circumstances. Now he prayed something unexpected. God, before you change my situation, change me. The room remained silent. No voice from heaven, no dramatic sign. Yet somehow, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. Not because he had answers, but because he was beginning to trust the one who did. Days turned into weeks, and although no major breakthrough appeared, small things began happening. A former client unexpectedly reached out. An old contact returned one of his messages. A freelance project appeared from nowhere. None of these opportunities solved his problems, not even close, but each one felt like a reminder that God was still moving, still working, still opening doors. Then something happened that Daniel couldn't explain. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork, he found a notebook he hadn't opened in years. Inside were business ideas he had written long before his company failed. Most of them were outdated, but one idea caught his attention. As he read through the pages, excitement began replacing discouragement. The concept seemed stronger now than it had years ago, more relevant, more practical. It was as if God had preserved it for the exact moment he needed it. For the next several days, Daniel worked tirelessly. He researched, planned, prepared. For the first time in a long time, hope began growing inside him again. But whenever hope starts rising, doubt often fights back, and doubt wasn't finished with Daniel. One evening, an unexpected phone call arrived. The news on the other end shattered his growing confidence. A financial obligation he thought was months away had suddenly become immediate. The amount was larger than anything he could currently afford. As the call ended, fear returned like a flood. His hands shook, his heart raced. Every positive step suddenly felt meaningless. The impossible mountain was still standing, maybe larger than before. Daniel sat alone in darkness. The old questions returned. The old fears returned. The old uncertainty returned. And for a moment, he wondered if faith had been nothing more than wishful thinking. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Rain began falling against the windows. The same kind of rain that had fallen on the night he first cried out to God. But this time, something was different. Instead of panic, a quiet determination rose within him, because deep down, he knew something now that he hadn't known before. God had not carried him this far just to abandon him. The story wasn't over, the silence wasn't empty, and the impossible situation standing before him was about to collide with a miracle he never saw coming. What Daniel didn't know was that somewhere at that exact moment, a single decision was being made by someone he hadn't spoken to in years, a decision that would change the course of his life forever. And when that person finally reached out, nothing would ever be the same.
The storm outside raged through the night. Rain hammered against Daniel's windows while he sat in silence, staring into the darkness. Sleep never came. Too many questions, too many worries, too many unknowns. By sunrise, exhaustion covered him like a heavy blanket. Yet somehow, beneath all the fear, there was still a small flame of faith refusing to go out. The next morning, Daniel's phone vibrated. He almost ignored it. Most calls lately brought bad news, more pressure, more problems, more reminders of everything that was falling apart. But something told him to answer. Hello? For a few seconds, there was silence. Then a familiar voice spoke. Daniel, it's Michael. Daniel froze. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 5 years. Michael had once been one of his closest business partners. They had built dreams together, shared victories together. But after the collapse of Daniel's company, life pulled them in different directions. Eventually, they stopped talking altogether. Michael? Yeah, the voice replied softly. I know it's been a long time. Daniel's mind raced. Why was he calling now, and after all these years? The conversation began awkwardly. Small talk, questions about life, questions about family, questions neither of them really cared about. Both knew something deeper was behind the call. Finally, Michael sighed. Daniel, I need to tell you something. Daniel waited. What came next left him speechless. Years earlier, before Daniel's company failed, he had presented an idea during a meeting, an idea everyone dismissed, including Michael. At the time, they believed it was too risky, too unconventional, too unrealistic. The project was abandoned, or so Daniel thought. But after their company dissolved, Michael couldn't stop thinking about it. Over time, he secretly continued researching the concept, improving it, developing it, and eventually, it became successful, very successful. Daniel listened quietly. His emotions twisted inside him, part surprise, part confusion, part pain. The idea that once belonged to both of them had become something far bigger than either of them imagined. Then Michael said the words Daniel never expected. You were right. Silence filled the line. You saw something the rest of us couldn't see. Daniel swallowed hard.
For years, he had replayed those failures in his mind, questioning himself, questioning his judgment, questioning whether he had ever been capable at all. Now, suddenly, the story looked different. The failure he carried for years wasn't proof that he lacked vision. It was proof that timing matters, and God's timing is rarely the same as ours. Michael continued, "I've been trying to find the right moment to call you. Why now?" The answer came immediately. "Because we're expanding." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Michael explained that the company had reached a critical stage. They needed leadership, strategy, experience, someone who understood the original vision better than anyone else, someone exactly like Daniel. For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. The opportunity sounded impossible, the same word that had haunted him for months, impossible. Yet here it was, standing directly in front of him. Not because he forced it, not because he manipulated circumstances, not because he chased every door until one finally opened. It arrived unexpectedly, quietly, at precisely the moment when he needed it most. But the greatest surprise wasn't the opportunity. It was what happened inside Daniel's heart. Months earlier, he would have accepted immediately, driven by desperation, driven by fear, driven by the need to escape his problems. Now, something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't making decisions from panic. He was making them from peace. That evening, Daniel walked through a nearby park. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. Children laughed in the distance. Birds crossed the evening sky. The world seemed unusually calm. As he sat on a wooden bench, memories flooded his mind. The failed business, the sleepless nights, the unanswered prayers, the disappointments, the moments he thought God had abandoned him. And suddenly, tears filled his eyes, because now he could see what he couldn't see before. Every painful chapter had been shaping him. Every delay had been teaching him. Every closed door had been protecting him. Had God caused every hardship? No, but God had been working through every hardship, guiding him through valleys he never would have chosen, preparing him for a future he never could have imagined. For the first time, Daniel understood something powerful. Sometimes God doesn't remove the mountain immediately. Sometimes He uses the mountain to transform the person climbing it. The miracle was never only about changing Daniel's circumstances. The miracle was changing Daniel himself. Yet the story wasn't finished, because accepting Michael's offer would require one final step, a step bigger than any he had taken before. A step that demanded complete trust. A step that would determine whether Daniel truly believed everything God had been teaching him. And what waited on the other side of that decision would reveal a truth so powerful that would impact not only Daniel's life, but countless others as well. The greatest part of the journey was still ahead.
The next morning, Daniel stood by his apartment window watching the first rays of sunlight spread across the city. The darkness that had covered the streets throughout the night slowly faded as golden light filled the horizon. For a long moment, he simply stood there in silence. He wasn't thinking about money, success, or even the opportunity Michael had offered him. Instead, he was reflecting on everything he had endured to reach this moment. The sleepless nights, the unanswered prayers, the fear of losing everything, and the countless moments when he felt completely alone. Looking back now, he realized that every painful chapter had prepared him for this new season of life. A few days later, Daniel met Michael in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. They spent hours discussing plans, strategies, and the future of the company. Everything sounded exciting and full of potential. Yet Daniel noticed something surprising within himself. Months earlier, he would have focused entirely on what he could gain from this opportunity. He would have thought about financial security, status, and personal success. But now, after everything he had experienced, a different question occupied his mind. How could he help others? How could the lessons learned from his struggles become a source of hope for someone else walking through a difficult season? Over the following months, the company grew rapidly. New projects succeeded, partnerships expanded, and opportunities continued to appear. Yet the greatest blessing Daniel received had nothing to do with business. The real transformation had taken place inside. The man who once sat alone in a dark apartment wondering if God had forgotten him was gone. In his place stood someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate, someone who understood that true success is not measured by what a person owns, but by the character they develop through life's hardest battles. As the company continued to grow, Daniel began mentoring young entrepreneurs who were facing the same fears he once carried. One afternoon, a young man entered his office looking completely defeated. His shoulders were heavy with discouragement, and his eyes reflected exhaustion. Daniel immediately recognized the expression because he had once seen the same look staring back at him from his own mirror. For nearly an hour, the young man shared his story: failed investments, financial struggles, broken dreams, and the overwhelming fear that he would never recover. When he finally finished speaking, he looked at Daniel and asked a simple question: how do you keep believing when nothing seems to be working? For a few moments, Daniel remained silent. Then a gentle smile appeared on his face. Instead of talking about success, promotions, or achievements, he began sharing the story of his darkest days. He spoke about the nights when he cried out to God without receiving immediate answers, the seasons when every door seemed closed, and the moments when he genuinely believed his future had been destroyed. Because he understood something many people never learn: the most powerful part of a testimony is not the victory itself, but the faith that survives before the victory arrives. As the young man listened, tears slowly filled his eyes. Hope, which had almost disappeared from his heart, began returning. In that moment, Daniel realized something extraordinary. The pain he had once begged God to remove had become one of his greatest gifts. His struggles allowed him to reach people he never could have helped otherwise. The wounds he once viewed as weaknesses had become bridges connecting him to those who needed encouragement the most. Years later, Daniel often reflected on his journey. Sometimes he wondered what would have happened if God had answered his prayers immediately. What if every obstacle had vanished the moment he asked? What if success had arrived without delay? The answer became clear. He might have gained success sooner, but he would have missed the transformation that came through the waiting. He would have gained solutions but lost wisdom. He would have escaped the valley, but never discovered the lessons hidden within it. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Daniel opened the journal he had kept during his hardest years. Its pages contained fears, doubts, prayers, and questions that once consumed his heart. As he turned through the entries, one sentence caught his attention. It had been written during one of the darkest nights of his life. "God, I don't understand what you're doing, but I'm choosing to trust you anyway." Daniel stared at those words for several moments before tears filled his eyes, because now he finally understood. The greatest miracle was never simply that God opened a door. The greatest miracle was that God never left him while he waited for it. And perhaps that is the message someone listening today needs to hear. You may be facing a situation that feels impossible. You may be carrying a burden nobody else understands. You may be praying for answers that have not arrived yet. But your story is not over. Your silence is not abandonment. Your delay is not denial. Even when you cannot see it, God is still working behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, opening doors, and preparing blessings that are greater than anything you can currently imagine. One day, you will look back and realize that what felt like the end was actually the beginning of a much greater story.